Hey everyone, and today I'm talking about Dario Argento's 2004 film, The Card Player. The Card Player is a very special film for me because I remember it being the very first Dario Argento DVD I bought, with many more to follow, and this DVD here is that very one. I have since bought one more, even though this isn't my favorite Dario Argento film. Let me tell you something. I used to really write and say and speak quite negatively about this film here. The first time I saw it when it came out, I remember feeling let down and disappointed and being quite vocal about it on message boards in those days and privately with fellow film buffs. And as far as I know, this film's reputation hasn't really grown over the years. It's still known as one of Dario Argento's more disappointing films, as one of his lesser productions, and I'm just here to tell you how my re-evaluation of this film took place. I know at least one friend of mine who once wrote a nice blog article, a nice positive blog article on The Card Player, and at the time I remember thinking, okay, well, he's really scraping the bottom of the barrel here because this film is basically rubbish. But I have to say, over the years, my opinion of The Card Player has really changed, and my appreciation for the film has grown little by little, even though I still find it basically hugely flawed. Let's start a little bit with the basic plot outline. The Card Player is set in Rome, and it's a thriller, it's a giallo. There are two protagonists, you could say. They're both policemen. They're played by Stefania Rocca and Liam Cunningham, and they are on the trail of this maniac, of this serial killer. In the 70s, if you look at Dario Argento's 1970s thrillers and early 80s thrillers, the police was usually in the background, and it was the amateur detectives who undertook the investigation and unmasked the killer towards the end. Traditionally, Argento's characters were either writers or journalists or artists or art students, so people of creative and artistic professions, and the cops were usually there narratively to justify that minimum quota of realism, or to feed the character clues and give him leads to follow up. Like in Cat O' Nine Tails, for example, there is a cop played by Pierpaolo Capponi who's really friendly towards the protagonist and gives him all the latest info on the case so that the main character can carry on his own investigation. Whereas towards the late 80s and the 90s, the role of the cop in Dario's films has grown. And you'll see eventually in the 90s, the cop became like even the protagonist. If you look at the Stendhal syndrome, and here again in The Card Player, we have two cops as our leads. What they do here is they play online poker with the killer, and I guess for the film's vintage, that was still a relatively novel concept, and it provides for several quite static scenes, I'm afraid, in The Card Player, where we are basically sat with the cops at the police station looking at the computer screen as one of them is trying to win at poker against his opponent. So there is that lack of physical immediate threat or suspense, because there is always that screen barrier. For me personally, I don't think it was heightening the suspense, knowing that somewhere at the other end of the room there was a victim tied to a chair staring at the webcam. I found that it put a huge barrier and it lessened the suspense. And those poker scenes, they're quite static, and they are shown for long periods of time. So unless you're into poker, I guess those scenes might be stumbling blocks. I personally found them somewhat frustrating to watch. But The film on the whole has some moments which, if you're in the right mood, they are really enjoyable. And I'm speaking about the image of Rome. Once again, in The Card Player, Dario Argento has captured a different facet of that city. The Rome you see in The Card Player is totally different from what you saw, for example, in Tenebrae, or what you saw in the Stendhal Syndrome, or what you saw in bits of Profondo Rosso. Each time, I think this is one of the great things about Argento, is that each time he finds a new angle to portray that great city from. And with The Card Player, I think his approach was somewhat more, let's say it was a bit more realistic, I guess. If you see the streets of Rome at night, in real life, the ambience, the light, the feel is very similar to what you see in The Card Player. So it's sort of a little bit like a documentary feel to it. If you looked at Argento's earlier films, he would model the streets with light and very, very carefully frame the streets to create a very particular ambience which transcended just whether you were in Rome or Turin or elsewhere. Whereas here we're really quite pinned down. It's very obviously Rome. You see also parked cars. You see quite, you know, there is that feeling that it's a bit more of a sort of realistic documentary-like approach to filming the city, which might have had to do with the budget. I believe that The Card Player was somewhat, it was a smaller scale production when measured up against Argento's classic 1980s or 1970s films. The mystery angle of The Card Player is fairly weak. There isn't much interest at who the killer is, because we're not really fed clues to their identity, and the investigation is somewhat limited. So The Card Player doesn't really qualify as much of a murder mystery. It's more of a thriller with some almost TV-like ambience at times. A lot of the time we're stuck in the police station, which is this quite cold and neutral and impersonal space, and we are staring at the screen, and everybody's dressed basically in this, you know, they're dressed like suits and ties and everything, so it's quite formal and quite cold. Unfortunately, you cannot say that those sort of scenes are particularly appealing. But then again, the film, when we are outdoors, when we are left roaming the streets with some nice Steadicam shots, especially after dark, we do get some atmospheric moments. Especially there is a chase scene, I guess it's about 3/4 into the film. It's where this young character played by Silvio Muccino is he becomes the Card Player is after him, and there is a nice long chase scene where he's trying to save his life, and we get to see some of the narrow side streets of the older part of Rome, and also there is a nice chase along the river, you know, underneath the bridges, on the embankment. It's really wonderful. And this is, I mean, this is probably one of the scenes which makes me want to revisit The Card Player, because it has this atmosphere and ambience. The acting is not always easy to appreciate in The Card Player, because if you watch the English version, the voices, there is really that weakness in the dubbing, because it creates an extra barrier, I think, for the viewer, because the voices, it's not that the lip sync is mismatched. I don't have a problem with that at all. It's more that there is, you know, the vocal performances, the dubbing is really quite, it's not committed, and you can tell they're just you know, not really involved in their characters, and that hurts the film. I would like to see the film in the Italian dub and see whether the experience improves. Nevertheless, I would say that Stefania Rocca does a decent job with her character, even though her character is not a particularly memorable character. She's a cop, and she has a trauma because her father was a gambler, so there is that tie, so she's looking for, I guess, to redeem her father by trying to hunt this killer down. But it's all very sketchy, and yeah, the characterization isn't really the film's stronger asset. What are the strong points of The Card Player? I think especially today, looking from 2021 in the context of cinema today, first of all, The Card Player has gained in some nostalgia value, because looking back at the gadgets, the cars, even just the atmosphere of Rome of those days, you can tell, okay, this is an epoch which is gone. And so there is that. So it's becoming a bit of a document of its time, which I think most decent films really gain something when they are 15, 20 years old, when they have that extra dimension as documents of that time. And also, back when it came out, The Card Player, against the backdrop of the previous Argento film, against Sleepless, which was a real crowd pleaser, it was a real, very conscious throwback to Argento's glory days, both in terms of violence and some bravura scenes and some operatic set pieces. And Sleepless had its flaws, but it had an excellent score, and it had some nice Baroque touches here and there, which harkened back to Deep Red and other classics that Argento shot in Turin. And with The Card Player, from what I've been told, The Card Player was originally written to be set in Venice. However, the casting or the budget, whatever, something didn't work out, and the script was retooled in the last moment to be made in Rome, and there have been some drastic changes also to the story arc and the way the film ends. The final scene was meant to be, the showdown with the killer was meant to be, also have to do something with the poker game, but in a completely different setting, indoors. That's all I know. So some of the weaknesses in terms of narrative and in terms of the way The Card Player is put together probably owe to the fact that it was, let's say, it was a somewhat of a volatile production, and the last minute changes are maybe evident. Nevertheless, looking back at The Card Player from today's standpoint, it's definitely not the worst Dario Argento. He has made more grotesque and more frustrating films since. In fact, The Card Player comes across as quite tasteful and restrained, especially in terms of violence. I think the older I get, the more, I guess, the softer I grow, and I don't crave gore these days as much as I used to. So for me, watching something like The Card Player is sometimes it's just nice because it's not a graphic film. There are deaths, but they are not shown in explicit detail. The aftermath, we see sometimes the bodies, but we don't see the actual murder in great detail, which can be nice. However, it did have that aspect of kind of torture porn, where we were staring at the screaming victim through the eye of the webcam, and some very unflattering close-ups and at some quite ugly angles, which made me think of some poor US cop TV shows, I guess, which I guess is not a compliment. So yeah, what do I like about The Card Player besides nostalgia value? Definitely Rome. The way Argento chose the locations. There are some areas of the city where he's never filmed before, which he used in The Card Player, and I'm going to show you some of the film's original locations now. Okay, so here is the fountain, and in the film Remo, the young poker wizard, is seen running past this fountain, chasing this girl who's been distributing flyers, who's actually sent by The Card Player to lure Remo to his death eventually. And then there is this whole sequence, Remo's nighttime chase, which ends up on the bank of the river, and there are some magnificent shots, and there was a limited use of additional lights in this film. So there were some nice inky black nighttime shots in the card player, and there is also you also see this natural kind of yellowish street lights. So everything has that yellow cast in the nighttime scenes, which is quite true to life. So it definitely captures the atmosphere of the city as it is, not as in some other Argento's films where he's constructed some kind of an imaginative city, just using bits and pieces of some very suggestive architecture in Rome. But it's more of a, I think, just a sober look at the Rome, and not always the nicest areas. I mean, some of the parts are shot on the outskirts of what used to be the Mussolini areas of Rome from the, 30s and the 40s. There is that nice scene with the graffiti wall, and that's a nice location. That's quite far away from where the bulk of the exteriors were shot. And then there is that wonderful scene with the cannon, which is shot at the Gianicolo, at the top of the Gianicolo hill. And this is really amazing, because if you go to Rome, you really could see this cannon getting fired every day at midday, I think. To sum it up, Il Cartaio, the card player, definitely a flawed film, maybe not a good introduction to Dario Argento. The investigation is somewhat frustrating in this film. The search for the killer is somehow unfulfilling, and the characters don't really get to detect much of his identity. It's more that the killer pretty much reveals himself to them, even though they are cops, but their investigation proves relatively, they keep coming up with dead ends. The story structure is somewhat, let's say, it's somewhat uneven, and there are far too many poker scenes which are, let's say, not suspenseful and not really visually stimulating. But nevertheless, the film has handsome cinematography in the exteriors. There is a good score by Simonetti. I'm not a huge fan of Simonetti. I think he's done some relatively average scores for certain films, but here in the card play, I think he's on top of his game, and there is some nice electronica going on. I think maybe rather than buying the film, some people would probably just buy the soundtrack CD, and that would be good enough. And also the good thing is, I think Stefania Rocca's performance is decent, and she does well with a rather limited role. So this is not some lost masterpiece, this is not the best thriller, but it's definitely not the worst Dario Argento film, and The Card Player has the distinction of being one of his less violent films, and therefore maybe more accessible to a casual viewer. So yeah, I think that's it pretty much from me. I wonder what you make of The Card Player, whether you loathe it with a passion the way I used to, whether you think it's middling, do you even think it's worth rewatching? I personally think it's definitely a film that grows on you, but I would give it time. It took me years to come around to saying anything positive about it. I used to be really a harsh critic of The Card Player, and look at me now. It only takes 15 years at times. Yeah, thanks a lot for watching. That was me, Alex, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.